October 15th, 2023, when four young thugs set fire to an 81-year-old Marine veteran's American flag in his front yard. Laughing as they filmed it for social media, they thought they'd get away with just another viral prank. But what they didn't know was that within hours, 50 leather-clad Hells Angels would roll up to their hideout with engines roaring, and what happened next would make them regret ever disrespecting that flag. The question is, how did the bikers find them so fast? And what did they do when they got there? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The quiet streets of Riverside, Oregon, had seen better days. Once a thriving lumber town, it now existed as one of those forgotten places where the hardware store closed at 5 and everyone knew everyone else's business. On Maple Grove Avenue, where the houses sat with peeling paint and overgrown lawns, one property stood out like a diamond in the rough. 81-year-old Walter Brennan's modest ranch house might have been small, but it was immaculate. The lawn was trimmed with military precision. The white fence had a fresh coat of paint, and flying proudly from a pole he'd installed himself was an American flag that he raised every single morning at exactly 6 a.m. and lowered every evening at sunset, folding it with the same careful attention he'd learned 57 years ago in boot camp. Walter had served 2 tours in Vietnam with the Marine Corps. He'd earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, though he kept both tucked away in a drawer and rarely talked about them. His wife Margaret had passed 3 years earlier, and his daughter lived in Seattle with her own family. These days his routine was simple: coffee at dawn, the flag ceremony, a walk to the corner store for his newspaper, lunch at noon, and evenings spent on his porch watching the neighborhood wind down. But Riverside had changed in ways that troubled him. The old families were moving out, replaced by renters who didn't maintain their properties. Drug problems that used to be whispers had become obvious. Just last month, someone had broken into the Hendersons' garage 2 doors down. The police came, took a report, and nothing ever came of it. On this particular Tuesday evening, October 15th, Walter had just finished his dinner, a simple meal of grilled chicken and green beans, when he heard the rumble of a car engine outside. It was the kind of aggressive, modified exhaust note that shook windows and announced its presence 3 blocks away. He glanced through his front window and saw a beaten-up Honda Civic, primer gray with mismatched panels, rolling slowly down Maple Grove. 4 young men were crammed inside, ages ranging from maybe 19 to 23. The driver had his seat reclined so far back he could barely see over the steering wheel. Bass-heavy music pounded from speakers that distorted with every beat. Walter watched as they cruised past once, then circled back, this time parking directly across from his house. He had a bad feeling immediately. Something about the way they were looking at his property, pointing and laughing. One of them, a skinny kid with face tattoos and a red bandana, pulled out his phone and aimed it toward Walter's house. They were recording something. Walter moved away from the window, but kept watching through the gap in his curtains. The 4 young men got out of the car with an exaggerated swagger. The driver, who appeared to be the oldest, wore a black hoodie with the hood up despite it being 65 degrees outside. The one with the face tattoos, who the others called Tweak, carried his phone like he was filming a movie. The other 2, one heavy-set with a Raiders jersey and another tall and thin wearing designer knockoff sneakers, flanked them on either side. They crossed the street onto Walter's property without hesitation. His gut tightened. He moved toward his front door, his hand instinctively going to the deadbolt, but he didn't open it yet. Not until he knew what they wanted. What they wanted became horrifically clear within seconds. The driver pulled something from his hoodie pocket, a lighter. Tweak was narrating into his phone camera. Yo, check this out. We are about to teach this boomer a lesson about hanging his little flag. This is for the content, baby. Walter's blood ran cold. He threw open his front door and stepped onto his porch. What do you boys think you're doing? The 4 of them turned, and instead of backing off, they laughed. The driver flicked the lighter, flame dancing in the evening air. What's it look like, old man? We're gonna light this thing up. Gonna be content. That flag means something, Walter said, his voice steady but his hands shaking. Not from fear, but from rage he hadn't felt in decades. You boys need to leave now. Or what? The heavy-set one in the Raiders jersey taunted. You gonna stop us, Grandpa? Walter took a step forward, but he knew the reality of the situation. He was 81 years old. His knees ached. His back had pins in it from a Jeep rollover in Da Nang. Against 4 young men who clearly had no respect for anything, he was outmatched physically. I'm calling the police, he said firmly. Go ahead, Tweak laughed, still filming. They ain't gonna do nothing. By the time they get here, this flag's gonna be ash, and we'll be ghost. The driver reached up and grabbed the flag. Walter felt something break inside his chest, not physically but emotionally. That flag represented everything he'd fought for, everything his brothers in arms had died for. Seeing these punks grab it with their dirty hands, treating it like a joke for internet points, was more than he could bear. Please, Walter said, and he hated how his voice cracked. Don't do this. They ignored him. The driver yanked the flag down, pole and all, letting it drop to the ground. Then he bunched up the fabric, held the lighter to it, and the flames caught immediately. The synthetic material burned fast and hot, curling and blackening as the 4 thugs hooted and hollered. Recording every second, Walter stood on his porch, frozen, watching 57 years of service, of sacrifice, of meaning go up in smoke on his front lawn. Tears blurred his vision, tears of rage, of helplessness, of grief. The tall one in knockoff sneakers noticed Walter's tears and pointed. Yo, look, the old dude's crying. Get that on camera. Tweak zoomed in with his phone, laughing. Boomer's big mad. This is going straight to TikTok. When the flag was nothing but charred remnants and smoke, the 4 of them climbed back into their Civic, still laughing, still filming, and peeled out with a screech of tires that left rubber marks on the asphalt. Walter stood there for a long time, staring at the burnt remains on his lawn. His neighbors, the ones who'd seen it happen through their windows, didn't come out. Nobody did. That was the way things were now in Riverside. People minded their own business, even when something terrible happened right in front of them. Finally, Walter bent down, his knees protesting, and carefully gathered what was left of the flag. The edges were still warm. He carried the remains inside and set them gently on his kitchen table. Then he called the Riverside Police Department. The dispatcher was polite but unsurprising in her response. An officer would come by to take a report. They'd do what they could, but she didn't sound hopeful, and Walter knew that in a town where real crimes went unsolved, 4 punks burning a flag wasn't going to be a priority. Officer Daniel Kowalski showed up about 40 minutes later. He was young, maybe 30, and he seemed genuinely sympathetic as Walter recounted what happened. He took photos of the burnt flag, wrote down descriptions of the 4 suspects and their vehicle, and promised to file the report. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Brennan, Kowalski said as he closed his notepad. Unless we can identify them quickly, this might be tough to pursue. Did you get a license plate number? Walter shook his head. He'd been too shocked, too angry, too focused on the flag burning. Kowalski sighed. I'm sorry this happened to you, sir. I really am. Thank you for your service. After the officer left, Walter sat alone in his living room. The house felt emptier than ever. He thought about calling his daughter, but what would he say? That he'd been disrespected by some punks and couldn't do anything about it? That he was just a helpless old man now? He didn't call anyone. Instead, he sat in the dark, staring at the burnt flag on his table, and wondered if the world he'd fought for even existed anymore. What Walter didn't know was that someone else had seen what happened, someone who was about to make those 4 thugs regret every second of their little prank. And by morning, justice would roll into Riverside on 49 motorcycles, with engines that sounded like thunder and men who lived by a code those punks couldn't even begin to understand. 3 blocks away from Walter Brennan's house, in a cluttered garage that smelled of motor oil and leather, 53-year-old Marcus Ironside Dalton was rebuilding a carburetor on his 1998 Harley-Davidson Softail when his phone buzzed. The text was from his neighbor, Rita Kowalski, Officer Kowalski's mother, actually, who lived on the corner of Maple Grove and witnessed the entire incident from her kitchen window. The message was short but loaded. Those punks just burned a vet's flag. Walter Brennan's place. Filmed the whole thing laughing. Cops won't do nothing. Marcus set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days. His jaw tightened as he read the message again. He'd lived in Riverside his whole life, served in the Army's 82nd Airborne in the First Gulf War, and had been a patched member of the Hells Angels for 26 years. The Portland chapter was his family, and disrespecting a veteran, especially one as decent as Walter Brennan, was the kind of thing that couldn't slide. He knew Walter. Not well, but enough to nod hello when they crossed paths at Donnelly's Hardware or the post office. Walter was one of the good ones. Kept to himself, never bothered anyone, and that flag ceremony he did every morning and evening, Marcus had noticed it. It spoke to something deeper than patriotism. It was discipline, honor, respect. Things those four punks clearly knew nothing about. Marcus pulled up his contacts and scrolled to a name, Reaper. Tommy Reaper Maddox was the president of the Portland Hells Angels chapter, and if anyone could understand the gravity of this situation, it was him. The phone rang twice before a gravel voice answered. "What's up, Ironside?" "We got a problem," Marcus said. "You got a minute?" "Talk to me." Marcus explained the situation, the burnt flag, the elderly Marine veteran, the four thugs filming it for social media clout, the police report that would likely go nowhere. As he spoke, he could hear the anger building in Reaper's breathing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Where'd this happen? Reaper asked. Maple Grove, Walter Brennan's place. Good man, 81 years old. Did 2 tours in Nam. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, you got descriptions of these punks? Working on it. Rita saw the whole thing. Says they were driving a grey Honda Civic, primer spots, loud exhaust. 4 of them, early 20s, probably local. Find them, Reaper said flatly. I'm making some calls. We're handling this tonight. Copy that. Marcus hung up and immediately texted Rita back, asking for more details. She responded within minutes. Face tattoos on one of them, Raiders jersey on another, and, most importantly, she'd managed to catch part of the license plate before they sped off. It was a partial, but it was something like 7JX. That was enough to work with. Within 30 minutes, the Hells Angels network was activated. Reaper called in favors from brothers across 3 counties. Someone knew someone who worked at the DMV. Another brother had connections with a bail bondsman who had access to databases the average person couldn't touch. By 7 p.m., they had a full license plate match, 7JXL429, registered to a Kevin K-Dog Ramsey, age 23, with a last known address at the Riverside View Apartments on the east side of town. The Riverside View Apartments were exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find people like Kevin Ramsey. A sagging complex of 2-story buildings with peeling paint, broken railings, and a parking lot full of vehicles in various states of disrepair. It was known locally as a haven for small-time dealers, addicts, and people who'd burned too many bridges to live anywhere else. Marcus rode his Harley over to Reaper's place, a modest house on the outskirts of Portland, where the chapter often gathered. When he arrived, there were already a dozen motorcycles parked outside. Inside, the living room was packed with leather-clad brothers, all patched members of the Portland Hells Angels, ranging in age from their late 20s to their 60s. Reaper stood at the center, a bear of a man at 6'4", with a grey beard down to his chest and arms covered in tattoos that told stories of a hard life lived on his own terms. He commanded respect not through intimidation, though he could certainly be intimidating, but through loyalty and a strict code of honor that every member understood. "Listen up," Reaper said, his voice cutting through the low rumble of conversation. "We got 4 punks who thought it'd be funny to burn an 81-year-old Marine's flag today. Filmed it, laughed about it, made him cry on his own front lawn." The room went silent. A few of the older members shook their heads in disgust. "We know where they're holed up," Reaper continued. "Riverside View Apartments, East Side. We're gonna pay them a visit. But here's the deal. We do this smart. No violence unless they start it. We're gonna make a point. We're gonna scare the hell out of them. But we're not giving the cops a reason to come after us. Understood?" There was a chorus of agreement. These weren't hot-headed kids looking for a fight. These were men who understood consequences, who knew that making a statement didn't require throwing punches. It required presence, intimidation, and making someone understand they'd crossed a line. "How many are we taking?" asked a member named Bulldog, a stocky man with a scarred face and a reputation for being unshakable. "Everyone who can ride," Reaper said. "I want them to hear us coming from a mile away. I want every resident in that apartment complex to know why we're there. And I want those 4 punks to understand they messed with the wrong veteran." By 8 p.m., 50 Hells Angels members had assembled in the parking lot outside Reaper's house. The sound of 50 Harley-Davidson engines rumbling to life was like rolling thunder. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches to watch. Some waved. They knew the Angels. In this part of Oregon, the Hells Angels weren't just a motorcycle club. They were part of the community. They organized charity rides for veterans, raised money for children's hospitals, and yes, they handled problems that the police couldn't or wouldn't. Marcus Ironside Dalton straddled his Softail, feeling the familiar vibration of the engine between his legs. He glanced around at his brothers, men from all walks of life, united by a code, by loyalty, by respect. There was Bulldog, who'd served in the Marines. There was Preacher, a former Navy SEAL who'd found a new family after leaving the service. There was Wrench, a mechanic who could fix anything with 4 wheels or 2, and dozens more, each with their own story, their own reason for being here tonight. Reaper raised his fist, the signal to roll out. The formation was tight, disciplined, 2 columns with Reaper at the front. They pulled out onto the highway, and the sound was deafening. 50 motorcycles moving as one, headlights cutting through the growing darkness, exhaust pipes roaring like a mechanical war cry. People in cars pulled over to let them pass. Pedestrians stopped and stared. A few pulled out their phones to record, posting videos with captions like "Hell's Angels." Rolling deep tonight, and something's about to go down in Riverside. They had no idea how right they were. The ride from Portland to Riverside took 25 minutes on the highway. As they approached the Riverside View Apartments, Reaper slowed the formation, and they rolled through the parking lot like a slow-motion tsunami of leather and chrome. Residents came out of their apartments, drawn by the noise. Some recognized the patches and immediately understood this wasn't a social call. The gray Honda Civic with the license plate 7JXL429 was parked in front of Building C, 3rd unit from the left. Reaper pulled up directly beside it and killed his engine. One by one, the other 49 riders did the same, creating a semicircle around the building entrance. The silence that followed the engine cut-off was almost louder than the noise had been. Marcus dismounted and walked up to stand beside Reaper. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from adrenaline, from purpose. This was about more than a burnt flag. This was about drawing a line in the sand and saying, some things still matter. Some people still deserve respect. A light flickered on in the 3rd floor unit. A curtain moved. Someone inside had just realized they had a very big problem. Reaper looked up at the window, crossed his arms, and waited. He didn't need to knock. He didn't need to shout. The presence of 50 Hells Angels surrounding your hideout sent a message louder than any words ever could. The question now was, how would those 4 punks respond? Inside apartment C307, Kevin K-Dog Ramsey was sprawled on a stained couch, scrolling through his phone with a satisfied grin. The video of them burning the old man's flag had already gotten 3,000 views on TikTok in just a few hours. Comments were rolling in, some people calling them idiots, but plenty of others laughing, sharing, egging them on. Tweak was in the kitchen mixing a drink, still riding the high of their content creation. The other 2, Marcus Big M Williams in the Raiders jersey and Darnell D-Money, Foster in the knockoff sneakers. We're playing video games on a TV with a cracked screen. Yo, we should do more stuff like this, Tweak said, walking back into the living room. This is blowing up. We get enough followers. We can start making real money off this. That old dude's face, though, Big M laughed without taking his eyes off the screen. When did he started crying? That was comedy gold. Kevin was about to respond when he heard it, a sound that started as a distant rumble and grew into something that shook the walls of the apartment. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a freight train. It was engines. Lots of them. What the hell is that? Darnell said, pausing the game. Kevin got up and walked to the window, pulling back the dirty curtain. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. The parking lot was filled with motorcycles. Not just a few, dozens of them, arranged in a perfect semicircle around their building. And standing next to those bikes were men in leather vests covered in patches, arms crossed, all staring up at his window. Hell's Angels. "Oh shit," Kevin whispered. "Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit." "What?" Tweak came up behind him and looked out. His face went pale. "Are those Hell's Angels?" Kevin finished. "There's gotta be like 50 of them down there." "Why are they here?" Big M asked, but his voice cracked. He already knew. They all knew. "The flag," Darnell said quietly. "The old dude's flag. He must have been a veteran," Kevin said, his mouth suddenly dry. "We burned a veteran's flag, and now the Hell's Angels are outside our apartment." The four of them stood frozen, staring down at the intimidating wall of leather and muscle below. No one was moving. No one was shouting. They were just standing there, waiting. And somehow that was more terrifying than if they'd been banging on the door. Tweak's phone buzzed. It was a message in their group chat from someone named Lil Sav, who lived in Building B. "Bro, are you seeing this? The Angels are at your spot. What did you do?" More messages started flooding in from people in the complex. Everyone had their phones out now, recording from windows and doorways, posting to social media. Within minutes, the presence of 50 Hell's Angels at Riverside View Apartments was trending locally. "What do we do?" Darnell asked, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "I don't know," Kevin said. I don't know. Maybe they'll just leave," Bigham offered weakly. Nobody believed that. Down in the parking lot, Reaper stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the window where he could see shadows moving. He'd been doing this long enough to know fear when he saw it. Those punks were panicking up there, and good. They should be. Marcus stood beside him, along with Bulldog and Preacher. The rest of the brothers maintained their positions, creating a perimeter that made it clear. Nobody was getting in or out without going through them. "How long are we waiting?" Bulldog asked quietly. "As long as it takes," Reaper replied. "They'll come down. Fear eats at you. Give it time." A woman in her 40s approached cautiously from Building A. She recognized Marcus. "What's going on?" she asked nervously. "Nothing that concerns you, ma'am," Marcus said politely. "You might want to stay inside for a bit. This'll be over soon." She nodded quickly and retreated. Word was spreading through the complex now. The Hell's Angels were here for the guys in C307, the ones who'd burned that veteran's flag. Most residents wanted nothing to do with Kevin and his crew anyway. They were loud, disrespectful, constantly causing problems. If the Angels wanted to teach them a lesson, nobody was going to stand in their way. Back in the apartment, Kevin was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. Okay, we can't stay here. We gotta go out the back." "There is no back exit from this building," Tweak said. "Fire escape goes right down to the parking lot. They'll see us. Then we wait them out." "For how long?" Darnell demanded. "They're Hell's Angels, man. They got nothing but time. We got like half a bag of chips and some warm beer. What's our plan? Starve them out?" Kevin pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the cops." "And tell them what?" Big M said. "That we burned some dude's flag and now there's bikers outside? They'll laugh at us." Kevin called anyway. The 911 dispatcher entered, and Kevin tried to sound calm as he explained that there were gang members surrounding his apartment building and he felt threatened. The dispatcher asked if anyone had made threats or attempted to enter the building. Kevin admitted no, they were just standing there. "Sir, if they haven't committed any crime or threatened you directly, there's not much we can do," the dispatcher said. "They're on public property. If they attempt to enter your residence or make threats, call us back." Kevin hung up, defeated. The police weren't coming to save them. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The angels didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like statues made of leather and steel, their presence alone delivering a message more powerful than any words. Inside the apartment, the 4 young men were coming apart. Tweak was chain-smoking by the window. Big M was stress-eating the last of their snacks. Darnell sat on the floor with his head in his hands. Kevin kept pacing, his mind racing through scenarios. None of them good. "Maybe we should just go talk to them," Darnell finally said. "Are you crazy?" Kevin snapped. "Look around, man. We're trapped. They're not leaving. Cops aren't coming, and sooner or later we gotta eat or sleep or something. We can't hide up here forever." "He's right," Tweak admitted quietly. "We messed up. We messed up bad." Kevin slumped against the wall. His hands were shaking. That rush he'd felt earlier, burning the flag, getting those views and likes. It all seemed so stupid now, so childish. They'd treated it like a game, like content, like nothing had consequences. But consequences had arrived on 50 motorcycles. "All right," Kevin said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right, we go down. We apologize. Maybe they'll do what?" Big M said bitterly. "Let us off with a warning." "Dude, we disrespected a veteran. These guys live by that military brotherhood stuff. We're screwed." Down in the parking lot, Reaper's phone vibrated. It was a text from one of the younger members watching the building's side entrance. "Movement at the front door. I think they're coming out." Reaper didn't respond. He simply straightened his posture and waited. The front door to Building C opened slowly. Kevin stepped out first, his hands visible and empty, trying to look non-threatening. His 3 friends followed, clustering close together like prey animals sensing predators nearby. The 4 young men made their way down the exterior stairs, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. Residents watched from windows and doorways, phones recording every second. This was going to be all over social media within the hour. When Kevin reached the bottom of the stairs, he found himself face to face with Reaper. Up close, the man was even more imposing. Kevin had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes, and what he saw there made his stomach drop. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even anger. It was disappointing, contempt, the look you'd give someone who wasn't even worth your time. "You boys know why we're here?" Reaper asked, his voice calm and low. Kevin nodded, unable to speak. "Say it out loud," Reaper commanded. Kevin swallowed hard. "The flag. We burned a flag today." "Not just a flag," Marcus stepped forward. "An 81-year-old Marine veteran's flag. A man who served 2 tours in Vietnam. A man who's lived in this community for 40 years without bothering anyone. And you 4 thought it'd be fun to burn his flag, film it, mock him while he cried, and post it online for likes." Tweak was crying now, tears streaming down his face. "We didn't know he was a veteran. You didn't care," Bulldog cut him off. "That's the problem. You didn't care about anything except your little video." The 4 young men stood there, surrounded by 50 battle-hardened bikers who'd formed a tighter circle around them now. There was no escape, no way out except through this moment. Reaper let the silence hang for a long moment. Then he spoke, his words measured and deliberate. "You 4 have a choice to make right now, and what you choose is going to determine whether you walk away from this or whether we make your lives very, very difficult. Do you understand me?" They nodded frantically. "Here's what's going to happen," Reaper continued. "Tomorrow morning you're going to Walter Brennan's house. You're going to apologize to that man sincerely. You're going to buy him a new flag, a proper one, and you're going to install it yourself. Then you're going to spend the next 3 months doing yard work for every veteran in this town who needs it. Free of charge." Kevin started to nod, relief washing over him. They were getting a way out. "I'm not finished," Reaper said coldly. "You're also going to delete that video and any copies of it. You're going to post an apology online explaining what you did and why it was wrong. And if I ever hear about you four disrespecting another veteran, another flag, or doing anything remotely like this again, we won't just show up at your apartment. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir," they said in unison, voices shaking. "One more thing," Marcus added. "You see this?" He gestured to the 50 men surrounding them. "This is what happens when you disrespect something that matters. Remember it." Reaper nodded to his brothers. "Let's roll." The Hells Angels mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring to life once again. They didn't speed off dramatically. They left the same way they came, slowly, deliberately, making sure those 4 young men felt every second of their presence. As the last motorcycle disappeared into the night, Kevin and his friends stood in the parking lot, surrounded by their neighbors who'd watched the whole thing. No one was laughing now. No one was impressed. They'd learned a hard lesson tonight. Some things are bigger than internet clout. Some people deserve respect. And some lines, once crossed, bring consequences you never saw coming. Walter Brennan woke up Wednesday morning at 5:30, like he had every day for the past 50 years. The sun hadn't risen yet. His house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, remembering what had happened the previous evening. The burnt flag was still on his kitchen table where he'd left it, a pile of charred fabric that used to represent everything he believed in. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 4 young men laughing, saw the flames consuming the stars and stripes, heard their taunts as they mocked his tears. He forced himself out of bed, his joints protesting as they always did in the morning. His routine was disrupted now. There was no flag to raise at 6 a.m. The pole still stood in his front yard, empty and bare like a skeleton, a reminder of what had been taken from him. Walter made his coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the burnt flag in front of him. He should throw it away properly. There were protocols for disposing of damaged flags, but he couldn't bring himself to do it yet. Part of him wanted to keep it, evidence of what happened, proof that the world had changed in ways he didn't recognize anymore. At 7:15, there was a knock at his door. Walter frowned. Nobody came by this early. He set down his coffee and walked to the front door, peering through the peephole. What he saw made him step back in surprise. Standing on his porch were the 4 young men from yesterday, but they looked different now. Their heads were down, their shoulders slumped. The cocky swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine shame. And standing behind them, leaning against a pickup truck at the curb, was a massive man in a leather vest covered in patches. Walter opened the door slowly, keeping the chain lock engaged. "What do you want?" Kevin stepped forward, his eyes red like he hadn't slept either. In his hands was a folded American flag, a proper one, still in its packaging. "Mr. Brennan, sir." "We came to apologize." Walter's jaw tightened. "Little late for that, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," Kevin said, his voice cracking. "It is, but we need you to know we're sorry. What we did was wrong. It was disrespectful and cruel, and we had no right to do that to you or to that flag." Tweak stepped forward next, tears already streaming down his face. "I deleted the video, sir. From everywhere. TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, it's all gone. And I posted an apology explaining what we did and why it was the worst thing I've ever been part of." Big M and Darnell both nodded, looking at the ground. "We're sorry, Mr. Brennan," they said together. Walter looked past them to the man by the truck. The biker gave him a slight nod of respect. Suddenly, Walter understood. These boys hadn't come here on their own. They'd had some help realizing the error of their ways. "We brought you a new flag," Kevin continued, holding it out. "And if you'll let us, we'd like to put it up for you. Properly." Walter studied their faces. He'd seen a lot of things in his 81 years. Combat, loss, betrayal, redemption. He'd learned that people could surprise you, both for better and worse. These 4 had shown him their worst yesterday. Now they were trying to show him something different. He unhooked the chain and opened the door fully. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see if you can do it right." The four young men worked in near silence, treating the flag and the pole with a care they hadn't shown anything in years. Kevin climbed the ladder to reattach the mounting bracket that had been damaged. Donnell and Bigham steadied the pole, while Tweak carefully unfolded the flag, making sure not to let it touch the ground. Walter watched from his porch, arms crossed. The biker, he'd introduced himself as Reaper, stood next to him, also watching. "They showed up at your apartment?" Walter asked quietly. 50 of us, Reaper confirmed. "Figured they needed to understand that actions have consequences. You didn't hurt them, didn't have to. Sometimes the threat is enough. Sometimes making someone face what they've done is punishment enough." Reaper glanced at Walter. "You served in Nam?" "2 tours. 68 and 69 Marine Corps." Reaper nodded with respect. "Army, Gulf War, different war, same brotherhood." They stood in companionable silence. 2 veterans watching 4 young men learn a lesson they should have been taught long ago. When the flag was properly mounted and raised, Kevin came down the ladder. The 4 of them stood at attention, poorly, awkwardly, but they tried, and saluted the flag. It wasn't a military salute. It was sloppy and unpractical, but it was genuine. Walter felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "Mr. Brennan," Kevin said, turning to face him. "The Hells Angels said we need to do yard work for veterans in town for the next 3 months. We're gonna do it, but we'd like to start with you, if that's okay. Your lawn, your gutters, anything you need done, we'll do it." Walter considered this. Part of him wanted to tell them to leave and never come back. But another part, the part that had seen young men make mistakes in war, the part that believed in second chances, recognized something in their eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. Fear, yes, but also understanding, maybe even growth. "Gutters need cleaning," Walter said finally. "And the fence could use another coat of paint." "We'll take care of it," Kevin promised. Over the next several hours, Walter watched as the 4 young men worked. They didn't complain, didn't take breaks every 5 minutes to check their phones, didn't blast music or goof around. They worked like people who understood they were paying a debt, neighbors noticed. Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down came over with lemonade. "Are those the boys who—" "They're making it right," Walter said simply. Word spread quickly through Riverside. By noon, other veterans in the neighborhood had come by to introduce themselves and offer Walter their support. Men he'd only nodded to in passing for years suddenly became brothers again. Marine Corps, Army, Navy, Air Force, it didn't matter. They'd all served. They all understood what that flag meant, and they all had lawns that needed mowing, gutters that needed cleaning, fences that needed painting. By the end of the day, Kevin, Tweak, Big M, and Donnell had a list of 17 addresses, all veterans who could use help with yard work. The Hells Angels had made some calls, spreading the word through the veteran community. The 4 young men had their work cut out for them. As the sun began to set, Walter performed his evening flag ceremony. But this time he wasn't alone. The 4 young men stood respectfully off to the side, watching as he lowered the flag with the same careful precision he'd shown for 57 years. He folded it properly, the triangular fold that every veteran knows. Each crease meaningful, each movement deliberate. When he was finished, he held it against his chest for a moment, then turned to face the 4 of them. "You know what this flag represents?" he asked. "Freedom." Tweak offered hesitantly. "More than that," Walter said. "It represents every person who put on a uniform and said, 'I'll stand between my country and those who would harm it.' It represents every parent who sent their child to war, not knowing if they'd come home. It represents every widow, every orphan, every veteran who came back with pieces of themselves left on some foreign battlefield." He held up the folded flag. "When you burned this yesterday, you weren't just burning cloth. You were spitting on sacrifice. You were telling everyone who ever served that their service meant nothing, that their brothers and sisters who died meant nothing." The 4 young men stood silently, absorbing his words. "But here's the thing about America," Walter continued, his voice softening slightly. "Here's the thing about that flag. It also represents the idea that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define you, that you can be better tomorrow than you were today. He looked each of them in the eye. You did something terrible yesterday, but today you started making it right. That's the first step. The question is, will you take the second step? And the third? Will you be better men a year from now than you are today? Kevin nodded, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, sir, we will. Then maybe there's hope for you yet, Walter said, as the four young men left. Climbing into Kevin's beat-up Civic, they weren't the same people who'd pulled up to this house 24 hours earlier. Something fundamental had shifted. The world had taught them a lesson they'd never forget. Walter watched them drive away, then looked at the flag now folded and resting in his arms. Tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., he'd raise it again. The routine would continue. Life would go on. But something had changed in Riverside, too. The community had been reminded that some things still mattered, that some people still stood for something. That respect wasn't a suggestion, it was a requirement, and if you forgot that, if you crossed certain lines, there were still people out there, whether they wore military uniforms or leather vests, who would remind you. 50 motorcycles worth of reminder. If necessary, Walter smiled slightly at the thought, then went inside to make dinner. His flag was flying again. His community had rallied around him, and four young men who'd been lost had maybe, just maybe, found their way to something better. It wasn't justice in the traditional sense. No arrests, no trials, no official punishment. But sometimes justice looked like 50 Hell's Angels standing silent in a parking lot. Sometimes it looked like four young men learning to respect something bigger than themselves. And sometimes, Walter thought as he closed his door, justice looked like an old Marine getting his flag back and knowing that people still cared about the things that mattered. That was enough. 3 months later, Riverside had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. It started with those 17 veteran addresses that Kevin, Tweak, Big M and Darnell had been given. Every Saturday and Sunday, without fail, the four of them would show up at a different house, trimming hedges, mowing lawns, cleaning gutters, painting fences, hauling away junk that had accumulated over years. They worked in silence mostly, focused and deliberate, understanding that every hour they put in was another step toward redemption. But something unexpected happened along the way. The veterans they worked for started talking to them, not lecturing, just sharing. Stories from Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Stories of sacrifice, brotherhood, loss and survival. The kind of stories that changed how you saw the world. Tweak, who'd never held a real job in his life, found himself sitting on the back porch of a 76-year-old Navy veteran named Robert Chen, listening to stories about serving on an aircraft carrier during the Cold War. Kevin spent an afternoon helping a 63-year-old Army veteran named Patricia Valdez organize her garage, hearing about her time as a medic in Iraq and the soldiers whose lives she'd saved. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. These weren't just old people. They were human beings who'd given years of their lives in service to something bigger than themselves. And for the first time, the four young men began to understand what they'd really done when they burned that flag. By the end of the first month, other young people in Riverside started noticing. A few asked if they could help. Then a few more. What started as punishment for four idiots became something larger, a volunteer corps of young people helping veterans with tasks they could no longer do themselves. The Hells Angels watched from a distance, satisfied. Reaper would occasionally ride by one of the work sites, give a nod of approval, and move on. They didn't need to hover. The message had been delivered, received, and internalized. Walter Brennan's life had changed too, though in quieter ways. His flag ceremony each morning and evening had become a neighborhood fixture that people actually paid attention to now. Parents would walk by with their children and stop to watch, using it as a teaching moment. See that man? He's a veteran. That flag means something to him. We should respect that. The isolation Walter had felt after Margaret's death began to lift. Veterans he'd only known in passing became regular visitors. They'd share coffee on his porch, swap old war stories, talk about the trailblazers or the weather or nothing in particular. Just the companionship of people who understood. His daughter called more often now. She'd seen the news coverage because, yes, the story had made the news. Local stations picked it up. Hell's Angels defend veteran after flag burning. It went regional, then national. The narrative was irresistible. An elderly Marine veteran, disrespectful punks, and a motorcycle club delivering old-fashioned justice. Some commentators criticized the Angels' methods. Others praised them. But everyone agreed on one thing. What those 4 young men had done was reprehensible, and Walter Brennan deserved better. Kevin Ramsey sat in his apartment one evening in late January, scrolling through his phone. His TikTok account, the one that had once been filled with stupid pranks and juvenile content, now showed something completely different. Videos of yard work, videos of veterans sharing their stories, videos explaining what he'd learned over the past 3 months. His follower count had actually grown, but for different reasons now. People weren't following him for chaos. They were following him for accountability, for transformation. His most popular video was titled, "I Burned a Veteran's Flag, and Here's What Happened." A raw, honest account of that night, the Hells Angels confrontation, and the journey since. The comments section was a mix of support and continued criticism, but Kevin read them all. He owed it to himself to face what people thought, good and bad. Tweak had stopped using drugs, not because anyone forced him, but because somewhere in those 3 months of hard work and meaningful conversation, he'd realized he was numbing himself to avoid dealing with life. Working with veterans, people who'd faced actual hardships and trauma, made his problems seem manageable in comparison. He'd enrolled in community college, something his mother had begged him to do for years. Big M had lost 40 pounds from all the physical labor. More importantly, he'd reconnected with his own grandfather, a Vietnam vet he'd barely spoken to in years. They had Sunday dinners now. His grandfather told him stories he'd never shared before. About the war, about coming home to a country that hated him, about surviving when so many of his friends hadn't. Darnell had gotten a job at Donnelly's Hardware, the same store where Walter bought his supplies. The owner, himself a veteran, had heard about what Darnell was doing and offered him a chance. "People make mistakes," he'd said. "What matters is what you do after." On a cold Saturday morning in February, the 4 of them met at Walter's house for what they knew would be their last official visit. The 3 months were up. They'd fulfilled the Hells Angels requirements. They'd worked for every veteran on the list, plus a dozen more who'd heard about the program and asked for help. Walter greeted them at the door with hot coffee and fresh donuts from the bakery on Main Street. Come in, come in." Too cold to stand outside, they sat in his living room, the same room where Walter had sat alone in the dark 3 months ago, holding a burnt flag and wondering if the world had lost its way. Now it was full of young men who'd been lost themselves, but had found something like purpose. "I wanted to thank you boys," Walter said, settling into his recliner. "I know this started as punishment, but what you've done these past 3 months, not just for me, but for every veteran you've helped, that's meant something. We should be thanking you, Mr. Brennan," Kevin said. "You could have pressed charges. You could have made this a lot worse for us. Instead, you gave us a chance to make it right." Walter waved his hand dismissively. "The Hells Angels gave you that chance. I just accepted their recommendation. Still," Tweak said quietly, "you didn't have to forgive us. A lot of people wouldn't have. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting," Walter said. "It's about recognizing that people can change. You 4 proved that you could. That's worth something." They talked for another hour about their plans, their futures, the lessons they'd learned. When it was time to leave, Walter walked them to the door, something he'd done dozens of times over the past 3 months. But this time felt different, final, in a way. The obligation was over. The question now was, what would they do with what they'd learned? As they reached the door, Walter stopped them. "One more thing." He walked to a closet and pulled out a cardboard box. Inside were 4 folded American flags. "These are for you," he said, handing one to each of them. "I bought them with my own money. I want you to have them. Not to burn, obviously," he added with a slight smile, "but to remember. Remember what they represent. Remember what you learned. Remember that you're capable of being better than your worst moment. Kevin took his flag with trembling hands. Mr. Brennan, we can't. You can and you will, Walter said firmly. And someday, when you have kids of your own, maybe you'll teach them what that flag means. Maybe you'll teach them about respect, sacrifice, and second chances. Maybe you'll tell them about an 81-year-old Marine who gave them a shot at redemption. All four of them were crying now, not ashamed of their tears this time. They each hugged Walter, something that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago, and thanked him. As they drove away from Maple Grove Avenue for what might be the last time, Kevin looked at the folded flag in his lap. 3 months ago, he'd set one on fire for internet views. Now he held one with reverence, understanding its weight in ways he never had before. We should keep the volunteer thing going, Darnell said from the back seat. Even though we're done with our requirements. There's still veterans who need help. The others agreed immediately. What had started as punishment had become purpose. They'd found something worth doing, something that mattered. Back at his house, Walter raised his flag as the sun climbed higher in the February sky. His routine unbroken once again. But he wasn't alone anymore. Across Riverside, in 17 other yards, flags flew that might not have been there if not for what happened that October evening. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best outcomes. Sometimes burning something down was necessary to rebuild it properly. Sometimes justice arrived on motorcycles, delivered by men who understood that true strength wasn't about violence. It was about standing up for what mattered and teaching others to do the same. Walter saluted his flag, a gesture he'd performed thousands of times over 5 decades. But today it felt different. Today it felt like victory. Not over enemies on some foreign battlefield, but over apathy, disrespect, and the idea that nothing mattered anymore. Today, in Riverside, Oregon, something still mattered. And 4 young men who'd forgotten that had finally remembered. That was a legacy enough for any veteran. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.